Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TEFAF Afternoons, part of our series of TEFAF Talks, TEFAF Afternoons, public programming at TEFAF. We're so pleased to have you here, and I hope it won't be your last time joining us for one of these talks. We started doing this in fall 2016 in the restaurant as TEFAF Coffee Talks, for anybody who remembers those days, those good old days, when we had to set up and then turn it around within 45 minutes so the restaurant could set up. But you were able in those days to bring your coffee into the room and drink it. We can't do that in this beautiful room. But we have instead this glorious setting to have great conversation, which is what we're going to be doing today. A little bit of housekeeping. One, please turn off your cell phones. We all, the best of us, forget to do that. The second thing is that this is live streamed on Facebook and will stay up on Facebook for a couple of weeks until the final edit when it will be up on the website, as are all the panels that we've done since the fall of 2016. I think we try to make sure that we have these up there both for your enjoyment for people who miss them, and also as an educational resource, because we take this programming very seriously in terms of both being enjoyable but also intellectually rigorous. Right?
Absolutely.
We're on it. I'm going to start by introducing Eric Shiner, Artistic Director New York of White Cube. He'll take it from there. Thank you, Eric.
Linda, thank you so much for organizing today's event, and we're all very happy to see so many people here today in the midst of one of the busiest art weeks here in New York City, with so many fairs going on and so many openings. And luckily for us, today's topic, a lot of really world-class public art on display across the city. So welcome, and we'll start by introducing our panelists. I'll start with Hank. Hank Willis-Thomas, one of the great contemporary artists of our age and a dear old friend, and luckily the author of at least one sculpture that is up in the city at this very moment. And to my immediate right, Joseph La Piana, a phenomenal sculptor whose work is literally mere feet away outside on Park Avenue. And you have several sculptures stretched north and south along the avenue. So we'll talk at length about those as well. To my left, Alex Greenberger. Alex, thank you for being here today. And Barbara McLaughlin from the Fund for Park Avenue, who has been stewarding the public art up and down Park Avenue. And thank you for that most decidedly. So how many of you have had the chance to go over to Rockefeller Center to see the public art that is on display there? Raise of hands? A few. Wonderful. The rest of you, please do go as soon as you humanly can. My dear friend and colleague, Brett Littman, who is the director of the Noguchi Museum, was asked to curate this large-scale public art installation for Frieze. And Frieze, of course, is the wonderful art fair on Randall's Island, and they thought, why don't we do something in Manhattan and make it fresh and relevant, and to invite some really relevant artists into the fold. And Hank, you were one of those artists, and you have one of your dialogue bubble sculptures in which the public is invited to actually sit inside and talk and to come up with hopefully a plan to save the future, if not having a little bit of gossip and a fun time while doing so. But I wanted to start with you and ask you what your first public art work was, who commissioned it, and how it all unfolded.
Well, actually, my first public artwork was, it was part of a class on public art taught by Nina Kachadorian, who's a brilliant conceptual artist, and I was at California College of the Arts in San Francisco, and the premise that she had was pretty much reclaiming public space, and so she took us around San Francisco finding kind of disregarded statues that no one had maintained, and we as a class decided that we were going to add some things to, like some plaques and other things to this statue that's in the middle of a circle, and we covered it and had a big unveiling, and ribbon cutting and everything, and it was really kind of, and for, I think the plaques and stuff stayed there for like 2 years before anyone actually noticed that there were some things that didn't belong there.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was kind of really exciting for me because I realized that there's a lot of space for creativity in public art, and that, like, you know, sometimes just staking your claim and making it seem official makes it official.
That's exactly the case, and we do have to think that there are always, of course, the official projects that happen and the very unofficial guerrilla projects. Thinking about street art in particular, artists like Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat and Ram Malzi, through to contemporary artists like Shepard Fairey and Cause, who all started their careers by illegally painting on the sides of walls. Joseph, yours is very legal and very thought out to the nth degree. Of course, we can talk about the realities of making public art happen later, I hope, because it is never an easy feat, to say the least. And your beautiful sculptures are right now installed up and down Park Avenue, and they're called tension sculptures. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the tension behind the work and contextualize them in today's age, and why you felt these were really important to be placed here in New York right at this particular moment in time.
Eric, thanks for the introduction. And you know, really for me, there's a heredity in my work that continues to evolve from itself, and these are really the footprint of these extrusions of original DNA that exist in my prior bodies of work. But outside of the conceptual realm of the work, pushing the boundaries of materiality, they really have to do with pushing the boundaries as we as a society are experiencing at the moment, you know, politically, socially, environmentally, and really how we are coping as a society, as a nation right now, with all that's being thrown at us. And so the parallel really between the sculptures and sort of what's going on around us are really sort of, you know, there's a clear sort of point of view that I express through them. And although I'm pushing the boundaries of the materiality conceptually in these sculptures, you know, the hope is that they're not going to collapse. And I think as a society, we're very much trying to hang on a thread and trying to sort of really keep it together. And to me, these sculptures represent the hope in that same way.
And they are absolutely beautiful. This was a project that Joseph and I did together in Venice as an attendant show during the Venice Biennale many years ago. 2 towers, twin towers, if you will, that were covered with the verse of Walt Whitman with an embedded soundtrack in the platform there, and absolutely beautiful work, which also had a great level of tension involved in it.
I'm glad you brought that up. So in the realm, sometimes people come to the studio and they don't understand the sort of relationship between each body of work, but conceptually, in the same way that Eric pointed out, this had to do with the sort of dichotomy and exploration and investigation of dialogue in relationship to Allen Ginsberg and Walt Whitman, and the palimpsest of these collages that are wrapped in these columns represent the force of tension between the two, in the same way that the tension sculptures really activate in the same way, but you might not understand the relationship between them because as they come to life, the physical life of them is very different.
No, absolutely. And Barbara, I'd love to talk to you about the history of the Fund for Park Avenue and why it's important for your organization to bring public art to one of the most famous avenues in the world, perhaps, and how long you've been doing it and why you're excited about what you do.
All right, well, I've been at the Fund for Park Avenue for 10 years, but the fund has been taking care of Park Avenue's parkland, which are the malls, for 40 years. And that includes 3 seasonal plantings, the spring tulips, which are out there now. Next in the summer will be the begonias, and then in the fall we will have mums, and all the relevant maintenance that goes with that, tree trimming, watering, mowing, trash pickup, all of that. And in the winter, we manage the Park Avenue tree lighting, which is an annual tradition that started in 1945 when fir trees were installed on Avenue and lit to honor the men and women who died in World War II, and that's been going on every year since then. And my job as the president is to raise the money to make that happen. We don't receive any funding from the city. All of our work is privately funded. And as I said, the malls are parkland, which means that we are under the auspices of the Parks Department's Art in the Parks program. And they've been placing art throughout city parks for over 50 years. And in the year 2000, the fund created its own sculpture committee to recommend artwork for Park Avenue. And I sit on that committee as an ex officio member, and Joseph's is our 30th exhibition. Mm-hmm. And I love it for me because it makes people look at Park Avenue differently and maybe think that, oh gosh, I wonder how all that happens, and wouldn't I like to support it? Because we're hiding in plain view, and the tulips keep blooming, and the begonia, everything keeps happening and happening, but it happens only because of people who make annual contributions. And the sculpture is just another way to, it just jolts you when you're walking down the street and you stop and look. And when after the snowy night of Joseph's installation, I'm sorry we can't show those pictures, but they wake up in the morning and there are these bright, beautiful yellow sculptures in March when there's nothing happening on the mall. So it draws attention to our work.
And I'm assuming most residents of Park Avenue love the project, and I also assume every once in a while you may get a missive.
Every once in a while, but mostly people love it, and all of our exhibitions are temporary, 3 to 6 months in length. But people tend to really embrace them, they have a sense of ownership, especially, the people that live, that look out at it all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So people feel, quite protective.
Absolutely, and they're always so incredibly beautiful. Now, Alex, as an arts writer, obviously you've written a lot about art in general and public art as well. And I wanted to talk to you specifically about the import of public art and what it does and what it means and what it says and where its power lies to open up new channels of communication out there.
I think it does a lot of different things. I'm trying to even think where to start with that question. I think maybe to start with it, I think it illuminates the role that a given artwork can play within a given community. I think you can recall many examples, some of them having positive effects, some of them having not positive effects, and some of them having both, where the community was in some way either shaped by this artwork or the artwork, was illuminating certain viewpoints within the community. I think a good example of this is the Olo Guibe work that was on view at Documenta 14 in Kassel, Germany, which ended up being erected within, I think now it's like a mall type area, outdoor mall type area, but there was so much tumult surrounding it because it was a work that was pro-refugees, and that raised all sorts of concerns about the far right in the country because they tried to forbid it from going up and so on and so forth. So I think that that work was able to start a real dialogue within Kassel, Germany, and beyond it actually probably about what a work of that sort can do.
Yeah, and certainly art, in of course, its very nature is incredibly powerful, and it can incite just as it can provoke, and it can bring relief just as it can bring fear and dread. And by putting a work out into the public sphere, you're going to get a wide variety of reactions. And I want to show one of Hank's recent works here, which is very much about the history of trauma, of pain, of the deep, deep scars left behind in this country through a legacy and horrible history of racism and slavery, and want to talk about where this is installed specifically and why it brings hope and relief, I hope.
Yeah, well, thank you. I was trying to think about why, the answer to your question you were asked, but I think it's public art. In our society, we're given the rules about where we're supposed to go, what's supposed to be there, who is supposed to be there, how things should be and how they should not be, and what's important and who's important and what's not important, et cetera. And I think what artists' role in our society is always is to question the status quo, question the norms, question the things that are taken for granted and that are given about who and what's important and why. And that's why when I get opportunities to do work in public, I often try to make work that has, even if it's a very representational work, a sense of mystery or question of like, who are these people? What is it about? What is it connected to? And also have encouraged people to have a connection to a historical moment. Speech bubbles are more fun, but they also do ask, like, how do we interact and how do we engage? Yeah. But this is an installation at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, also known as the National Lynching Museum, which was founded and created by civil rights attorney Brian Stevenson in Montgomery, Alabama last year. And it's part of a much larger kind of installation, which I do think that even though he's a lawyer, he kind of, the conceptualization of that and making of that space was in a creative gesture. And so I think of my work as part of his artwork. But this is also a sculpture that is referencing part of a photograph taken in apartheid South Africa in 1967 by a person named Ernest Cole. And it was a photograph of miners being strip searched. And they're facing the wall, and in the photograph you can see their butts, and they're kind of like you feel, I don't know, I felt the indignity in watching it. I also felt implicated by just looking at the image that I was bearing witness to, or a form of oppression. But I also thought that I couldn't ignore it, and I wanted to like think about it as connected to a larger history of not only oppression, but also people rising up in response and against it. And so we remade it as a life-size sculpture, but starting with just from the shoulders up, and titled it Raise Up. And to me, I see things, there is surrender, but there's also surrender as related to like a baptism and various other kind of ways in which like these gestures of like our hands raised. So slavery, communion, praise, that this work hopefully is referencing, but in the context of the lynching memorial, where it's facing all of this monument to these people who were murdered by society, I think it has an even richer kind of.
No, absolutely, and thank both of you for putting your work out there, because by that very gesture, it forces the types of conversations that this country has been really rather avoidant of, and those are the very conversations that we have to have in order to move forward, which is really where I think the main power of public art lie. Alex, there are a lot of things going on in the city right now. What is the thing that's exciting you the most in the public realm that you've seen in the past couple of weeks?
In terms of public art, you mean?
Yeah.
It's a good question. I would have to think on that. I mean, I definitely think that there's some really interesting work going on the High Line right now. I think the High Line has historically had a very interesting art program, because they don't only host work that it has something to do with the High Line or the surrounding neighborhood. Sometimes it actually refers to issues that exist far beyond it. So it's, I think, threading various issues, like the effect of digital technology on humanity and so on and so forth through a neighborhood, and showing how all these issues globally are connected. But I do want to say that one of the most exciting public art projects still hasn't yet happened. It's a David Hammond's work that's going to go up near the Whitney. And
exactly.
It's been really fascinating to watch all the bureaucratic wrangling that goes into making that happen.
Yeah, and that will of course inhabit the Hudson River. It will be the ghost or the shell or the outline of an historic pier over there, and we are all looking incredibly forward to it. And I'm glad you brought up the High Line. I encourage all of you to go see an amazing sculpture by Simone Lee that just was installed a few weeks ago, and it is a powerful African woman who towers over the High Line. And luckily you can all go to see one of Simone's sculptures right here at the fair at Luring Augustine. Their booth has a wonderful sculpture by Simone, who is a dear old friend. And she also happens to have an exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum right now, having just won the Hugo Boss Prize. So please do go and see that show, which is just absolutely stunning. And I love her work being there because, as Hank alluded to, it puts forth the notion in physical time and space that we are here now. Bodies that might not be welcomed or historically have been welcomed are not only there, present but powerful, and that is so incredibly important. Barbara, in the history of the Fund for Park Avenue and the sculptures here, what do you think has been the most radical project?
It might have been one that actually didn't happen.
These are always the fun ones,
and
the ones that didn't happen.
It was,
and why?
Well, it was Sir Anthony Caro, so you can see why it didn't happen. But it was right before he passed away, and there was going to be a structure that was going to cover 3 malls. And so we were all very concerned about, people climbing on it and, the safety issues, but it was going to be really cool. And so it was going to go over the trees and encompass 3 malls connected. So there are a lot of, proving public art, as we had talked about or alluded to. It goes through, as someone at the Core Club said, a gauntlet of approvals. Remember that, Joseph? I said, I'm going to borrow that phrase, a gauntlet. And so by the time it actually arrives on the avenue, it has been, checked and double checked, and the weight is okay and doesn't block sight lines, and it's durable. And then the community board has passed it too. So it does go through a gauntlet of approvals. But that one is the most exciting. That thing would have been very exciting. And they're all the exhibitions are exciting, I think.
Oh, absolutely, and certainly
In
thinking...
their time, but that would have been a real wow.
And thinking about those very realities, and I'd love to spend a little bit of time talking through those so that everyone is aware just how tough it is to make these projects happen, because in our very legalese-centric society of today, you can't get away with things that you would have been able to get away with 40 or 50 years ago. So when Isamu Noguchi was doing his public art and his playgrounds, you didn't have to worry about a kid getting a concussion on a sliding board as you do today. And the realities of installing public art are very real. And this is another one of Hank's great works, and I'd love to talk about the nitty-gritties of what it took to install this piece and how long it took and how many people were involved.
Sure. Well, so this is a 9-foot Afro-pick sculpture that was down at Police Plaza in Philadelphia, across the street from Philadelphia City Hall. Yep. But there on Fifth Avenue, there is a 25-foot Afro-pick sculpture that is outside of the Africa Center on 110th and Fifth Avenue. Yep. And first of all, it's exciting when you have an idea to see it realized at all. I was really inspired by Klaus Oldenburg and a lot of the ways that he would take kind of, quotidian objects like, a light bulb or clothespin or something, and make a enlargement of it and kind of ask the public of how we relate to those forms. And when I was a child in Philadelphia, so we'd pass that one, and so I really wanted to do an equally sized, I think there's a 40-foot clothespin. I want to do
Amazing.
an Afro-pick sculpture, because I remember that's when Afros were really popular. I had an Afro-pick, and it was like a metal pick, which is kind of hard for your hair and intense. So it really left an impact on me, and I always wondered why there was a fist on this comb. And in the city of Philadelphia, where there's was a legacy of police brutality and violence. My grandfather was a police officer. My father was a Black Panther. So there's a lot of also family stories related to that. Yep. Thought that, and there's a sculpture of Frank Rizzo, who was a police commissioner and mayor there, who often had a lot of tension with members of the African American community, that this sculpture was kind of in proximity to. And there was a great organization called Monument Lab that was born out of mural arts, where Philadelphia has all these really wonderful murals all over the city. And a few artists, Ken Lum and Paul Farber, among others, wanted to actually ask artists to do temporary monuments around the city, because Philadelphia has this rich legacy of both murals and the Liberty Bell and all these other really great American iconic objects. So we did this Afro-pick, and it was, I think, of course we have to make it, so how do you engineer it? It's it's doesn't really have a base to it. It's embedded they had to like cut up those tiles and embed that in and and engineer it. And when we were there, there were people like skating on it, et cetera. But more recently with the 25-foot version, which is closer to the 50-foot version I'm eventually going to make. We first actually made that for Burning Man. Someone asked me at the Met, someone friend who worked there was like, you ever want to do a sculpture at Burning Man? And I was like, well, I've always wanted to do this. But that one actually was made so that people could go inside and climb to the top of it.
Wow.
So in the middle of the desert is more like how, I guess, the rough and tumble days of old New York where you could do that. But doing it with the permission of the Department of Transportation in collaboration with the Africa Center, where we had to get approvals from the Department of Cultural Affairs and various other kind of entities. And because it's like, is it in parkland? Is it all? It was a really kind of exciting experience, but also wondering like the liabilities of like, what happens if, with these objects they bend because they're
with the wind.
with the wind, et cetera, and like, will somebody try to get inside? So we had to like rig that so people wouldn't. But it's really, for me, exciting that they become, especially in our social media era, that people want to go near these works and feel that they activate it by coming in proximity to it.
And I'm glad that you brought that specific thing up, because in our age of selfie culture, all of a sudden public artwork has become one of the most in-demand backdrops for the perfect selfie.
Yes.
And it is a really great way for artists to get their message out to audiences that probably otherwise wouldn't have seen it. Would you?
Yeah, no, I just have one of my favorite stories. And on the malls, we don't really encourage people to get up on them anyway, but a couple of years ago, we had Lalande sculptures, a series of them, and there was the monkey sitting on 57th Street, and had the arm was like this, and I'd walk past it on my way to work, and I'd noticed people had put like a scarf around. One day it was a pink scarf, and then the next day it would be a plaid scarf, and one day I saw a couple taking pictures of it, but they had put their baby in the arm of the gorilla, and they were backed up, like out in the street taking pictures. This was before Instagram, but it was great. It was crazy.
When we were dealing with the sculptures as well, because of the nature of...
Well, you were really dealing with nature
Yeah.
because you happened to install in the last snowstorm of the season.
Right, but also in the context of them being called tension sculptures, they were concerned about these being some level of a boomerang snapping and, literally taking someone out. Because literally the first piece that I ever created was a tension painting, a relief painting. And it was my first piece that I had explored in the context of this body of work. And I was almost done with a 40 by 60-inch stretcher, and it literally snapped like a boomerang and hit me in the head. I was knocked out. I mean, I had to be rushed to the hospital. So I realized very early on that outside of the conceptual realm of the work, there was the force of gravity and pure tension that existed in this panel. So when we discussed, this body of work in particular, I was delighted that they chose the tension sculptures over this other body of work, my corrugated sculptures, in the sense that I refer to them as living sculptures. Because in actuality, they are living. In order for them to maintain their composition and be under constant duress, there needs to be this pulling the materiality to the point of collapse. So there was a conversation in one of the community board meetings as well, talk about the sort of the red tape that needs to happen in order for something to happen. Some members of the certain community boards were like, well, are these safe? Or are they going to snap and kill someone? Or, and obviously those were all things that I took into consideration in terms of materiality, in terms of composition of these sculptures. But, I mean, it's certainly a real life circumstance and something that needs to be addressed. So it was an interesting conversation and dialogue to have in these meetings, as well as the selection committee when we discussed them originally.
Yeah. Well, on a much lighter note, someone told me this week, the big Frederick Law Olmsted hat lunch was this week, and a friend of mine said, oh, I wish that I didn't think of this idea until it was too late and I couldn't do it, but I wanted to do a hat with I wanted to recreate the sculpture on Park Avenue on top. And I haven't forgot to tell you that. I don't know if it, were you flattered by something like that, or is that, or not?
I mean,
they
you
thought,
know,
they
I
loves them, and thought, wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah.
Because those hats
When
are,
sculpture
those
becomes a
hats are-
fascinator, that's
Yeah,
wow.
exactly. It's bringing it right. You know, people-
I generally have pause in that.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I'm all
I was
about sort
curious.
of expressing your work in a different medium, but, you know, sort of, I'm very cautious about sort of exploring it in mediums that feel commercialized in any way. And although it's fun, and
It would have been
we
flattering.
know many artists
but
who have,
maybe for
you know, done that.
meant
and
in
I think in the right context,
Right.
in the right sort of keeping the integrity of the work intact is the, you know, the focus for me, and I'm sure for you, right, Hank?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And then I always love sculpture and public art that is slightly out of context, and we'll look at one more, perhaps. Here we go. This is Hank's and many other collaborators' project called Four Freedoms that happened around the country on billboards next to very highly trafficked highways in all 50 states. That happened about, what, a year and a half ago now?
No, just 6 months ago.
Has it only been 6 months ago?
Feels like 2
It does
years.
feel like 2 years ago.
Well, I
Time flies. But do you want to talk a little bit more about how you came up with this idea and literally put public art all across the country at the same time? It was such a massive undertaking, and thank you for doing it. But
Oh, thanks. Well, it's my friend Eric Gottesman and I, in 2015, before any of the presidential candidates had announced, were really interested in doing something creative around the presidential campaign, just because we thought, him and I tend to only speak around election campaigns, and then we would always like say what we would do, you know, and like do the armchair thing, like, oh, so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. And then we thought that maybe rather than not making our work and talking about what other people are doing, that maybe if we made our work, you know, doing it, we would actually feel productive as we were kind of going through this. And so he thought that maybe I should run for office, which I thought was ridiculous. And if you know me, you know it's ridiculous. But then we wound up deciding that we were going to start, we wanted to be taken seriously. So we started a super PAC. He bought a suit for the first time in 20 years and got a tie. And all of a sudden, we somehow very quickly became legitimate as art and civic engagement, political people somehow. And we're able to do exhibitions and billboards and town halls with different artists and different institutions. I think in 2016, we wound up working with 116 organizations in an anti-partisan way, but really trying to kind of make space, realizing that all the work that we do already is political, but people don't necessarily see that, and wanting to have more members of the public be able to see work like yours and see a lot of the depth and research that you put into it that they might often, you know, many members of the public may feel alienated from, and we realized we need to at least begin that. It maybe take 10 years, and so one of the projects we did was this 50-state initiative where we worked with over 116 artists to do about 200 billboards in all 50 states plus DC and Puerto Rico. We did about 100 exhibitions and 100 town halls, and one of the billboards that I designed was put up in St. Louis, and the reason that it was put up there actually by another artist named Modu Dang, and it was because you might recall when Michael Brown was murdered there that when the Black Lives Matter protest became really popular there was a kind of response saying all lives matter. All lives matter. And this idea that Black lives aren't part of all lives as a way to kind of like somehow take discredit or undermine this kind of really kind of, I think, powerful and meaningful statement. And I overheard someone say that, you know, all lives matter, but some more than others. And that I wanted to kind of show what's kind of between the lines when people say all lives matter, because all lives do matter, right? But you can't divide that. And so I had this said all lives matter, and there was an article in CNN about this project where we'd had all these billboard companies, everything lined up, and one company retracted their 40 billboards because they saw that article. And
Wow,
they
really?
thought that this was anti-Trump, but our president wasn't even the president
right.
in 2014 when that happened. So and that says a lot about the context, that because you can't even say lies without being anti-Trump.
Right? Rather telling, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, like you were saying, the interpretation of how people view a work and sort of the underpinnings of what the actual essence of it is fascinating in terms of, you know, people's perception of it, how each individual person, especially with public art, sort of views your work. And I know, and perhaps, you know, you can weigh in on this, I learned so much about my own work as a result of talking to people while they were interacting with the work. You know, it became so much more emotional, and it, you know, there was a connectivity with the public that I didn't expect. And as a result of that, I learned the relationship between them and the greater relationship of the work and the public through the project. So.
Absolutely, because of course everyone comes loaded with their own histories, their own backgrounds, and we'll each have a totally unique
And they
experience.
give the work life in a lot of ways,
Yes.
like because when it goes from your studio to the world, all of a sudden it has new meaning.
I joke around how, like, you know, like when the blooming of the flowers came in, there was like a cohabitation of sorts where these sculptures were really lonely, you know, and then suddenly, you know, being oxygenated by flora around them and suddenly being part of the environment that they're now living in.
Yeah.
You know, I thought about them as living sculptures, and I thought about them in a way that was much more emotional than I ever expected it to be.
Right, and you have that juxtaposition thus between the man-made and the natural, the organic.
Right.
Really, really beautiful. Okay, we have a few minutes left before we open the floor up to Q&A, but I want to ask one last question of all of you. And certainly, work that goes out into the public can be, by its very nature, provocative and insightful in both ways, in both terms of that meaning. But right now, there's a certain work of art here in New York City that could be one of the most polarizing things that's come up in this city in quite some time, and that would be the vessel at Hudson Yards. How many of you have actually climbed up and been on the vessel? Just, okay, a few of you, okay. So I want
been
to
to
ask,
it, but I haven't
I
climbed
would
it. I
like
haven't
to ask
climbed
the
it yet.
panelists, remember we are on video, what we think of Thomas Heatherwick's staircase to nowhere, as Michael Kimmelman called it in a review in the New York Times just a few weeks ago.
I have to say, I like it. I think it's cool, and I'm looking forward to climbing it and taking my Instagram shot.
Yep.
And Hudson Yards is a little bit similar to, well, a little bit similar to Park Avenue, but both are built over train tracks.
Ah, indeed,
And
yeah.
just one other connection between the Park Avenue and Hudson Yards is the memorial trees that were a part of last year's Park Avenue, the tree lighting, were collected by an artist named Hugh Hayden, and he was selected as one of the Shed's 52 emerging artists. And so those trees are going to be, instead of mulched this year, they are going to become sculptures, and they'll be
wow.
part of their the Shed's open call exhibition this summer.
Oh, fantastic.
So I feel a certain connection.
Yeah,
down there.
absolutely. Okay. Fantastic. Alex?
I do not like it. I feel like it has certain problems in the sense that, well, one of them is a very interesting one, that there was a group of disabled artists and activists and a bunch of others who protested actually at the vessel shortly after it opened, saying that there was no way for them to like be in the work, and therefore it wasn't connecting with them. And it's a perfect example, I think, of a work that isn't in dialogue with its community enough. I think that New Yorkers, actually, for the most part, most of the people I've spoken to don't want this work, and therefore that's a problem, in my opinion. But you know, it illuminates also, it touches on something that was sort of mentioned before as well, like the out of contextness aspect, and like when that can be a bad thing and when it can be a good thing. I don't know. I mean, maybe the artists here will have a better answer to that sort of thing than I would. But yeah.
Thank you.
I agree with you, Alex. I feel like there isn't a dialogue, an open dialogue anyway, that feels connected to the environment that it's part of. I think that with any work of art, you know, there should be some sort of connectivity, you know, whether it's, you know, it happens organically, hopefully in the best way, but to sort of have to pick at it to a point of like not understanding it completely. And I think compositionally, it doesn't feel right in the space. You know, from a materiality standpoint, I'm not thrilled by it. You know, I like to support other, you know, artists in their sort of execution of their work and their vision for their work, but, you know, certain things are not, that's the beauty of public art, right? I mean, not everyone's gonna love it, and, you know, you're open for criticism, unfortunately, but, you know.
Absolutely.
That's my 2 cents on it.
And Hank?
I'll say it's inspiring. It's not Q&A time yet.
Oh, but it almost is.
I think it is now.
I just, you know, there's a legitimacy that comes with having a city and a major kind of organization behind putting it up. And once you put something up, no matter what it is, it's going to be up whether people like it or not.
It's there.
And that's very inspiring to me.
Yeah.
And also, as an artist, you're not creating work to sort of satisfy anyone, you know?
Yeah.
So, you know, like, again, that work of art, you know, the countless amount of time and energy and hard work that went into putting it into place, you know, sometimes people don't take into consideration. So regardless of what the end result is, you know, whether you hate it or love it, I mean, you have to sort of honor the person who created it, you know? And I think we're all too quick to criticize everything to the point of, you know, it came from someone and it's someone's vision, and we can all have a point of view, but there's no reason to be, you know, unkind about it.
But it's also, to me, the audacity of it is also,
True.
which
Oh,
is what I'm,
Yeah.
like, I mean, like, there's a lot of stuff I've done is be like, oh, might as well. I can, like, something like, I should have a 100-foot Afro-brick sculpture.
Absolutely.
But I think artwork, I mean, look at this room that we're in, for instance. Like,
gorgeous.
there's something that, like, a lot of times, there's so much that doesn't make sense at the time that it's made and people hate and respond to that, like, 20, 30 years later, new generations become affectionate. Because New York is not the New York that New York was. Yeah. And I'm trying to prepare myself for the future where, you know, this is the iconic sculpture representing New York until one of us gets an opportunity to do something.
To do something better.
Yeah, and of course our
Better, but
where New Yorkers have been dramatically wrong about public sculpture. Like, for example, Richard Serra's Tilted Arc in the 80s, and I think it was 80s, in downtown Manhattan, where it was eventually removed because people hated it so much. It was just basically like a steel, you know, arc structure that, you know, not to harp on David Hammons too much, but Hammons actually peed on as a performance, and there are photographs of this that are now on view at Frieze, actually, and are worth seeing in their own right. They're by Dawood Bey. But, yeah. So there's instances where people have been wrong because that was actually a fairly significant work.
So then he's still doing them.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I view it as the perfect gateway drug. It's a really big pill that plopped down in the middle of Manhattan, and with tens of thousands of people climbing it every day, for whom we have to remember that for many of those people, this will be their first experience with public art, or maybe art in general. And at least some of those people, having had that great experience, feeling connected to a sculpture, might actually take the next step and go to a museum. And certainly as a former museum director, you always hope and pray that people will come into the museum and feel that the barrier was torn down ever so slightly by an experience that they had. And hopefully that's what it's going to do, so that people will have maybe a more enriching experience the next time around.
You hope.
Yes. So with that, thank you all very much for being here today. And I'd love to open the floor up to questions. Feel free to ask anything you so desire, and please don't be shy. Question in the back.
Hi, thanks for the positive ending note about the shawarma. I appreciate that, Eric.
I've been hearing that a lot lately, the shawarma,
Yeah, I mean, I won't go into a big thing about my opinion on it, but I have a question.
Well, you could. By the way, this is Natalie Kovacs, incredibly great curator who has done things like the Rain Room and many other amazing, very highly paid attention to project. Sorry.
Where were you?
I love public art and I love engagement, but how does this sort of project get approved? That was just a question for anybody who is involved in public art. Well, like, what's the process? Who has to sign off on, yeah, we want this shawarma, or no, it's not good enough for New Yorkers, or it's in a wind tunnel? Like, what's the approval process? I'm always curious. Like, now it's up there, and I agree, it's great that it's there, because now we have something to argue and debate about and consider, you know, as a lens or a point of focus. But how do these things happen? Because I've always wanted to know that about big, large-scale stuff.
Well, I can only speak about Park Avenue. And the way it happens on Park Avenue is that the sculpture committee recommends the artwork. They'll either, in the case of Joseph, members of the committee sought him out and asked him to submit a proposal. But also people do, artists submit proposals directly to us, and the committee reviews it, approves it. Once they do, then the city weighs in, and then it goes through that gauntlet of approvals, and it is reviewed by the MTA, because, you know, they have to, since we are over the railroad tracks, they really have to be concerned about the weight and all the safety issues that we discussed, and then it goes through a community board process. So that's what happened. That's how it happens on Park Avenue.
And
It could take about 2 years.
And I was surprised, actually,
Yeah.
toward the end in particular, that, you know, outside of, you know, our own engineering, that the city gets involved, and, you know, last minute changes needed to take place based on wind loads.
Yep.
You know, as things change, the cost of things escalate. And as an artist, you know, in a public project, you're really scraping to get these projects done financially. So every little change, every little addition to the project is stressful, you know, more than I even realized. I mean,
And that just one thing to clarify, the money that I raised for the Fund for Park Avenue, that's strictly for the planting. So the artist bears all the responsibility, and it's considerable.
so in my case, luckily through patrons of my work and, you know, people who support my work, we were able to raise a very large amount of money to sort of be able to do the projects, and I'm thankful for that.
To what extent is safety considered? I mean, I know it depends on the
Huge.
work, but
Huge.
yeah.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And I'm a commissioner for the city in New York for the Public Design Commission, which does approve things like Hudson Yards. And I recall when I came on, the part where Simone's sculpture, that plinth, I remember we approved that. I remember there were other things that we approved around there, but I definitely don't remember that structure. So it might have been, but typically, if it's on, this is a weird public-private partnership, and it's also in this land that is somewhat, I think, owned by, it's like because it's over top of the Amtrak yards, which might be state. I don't, there's a lot of weird kind of overlapping land stuff that happens there. So it's probably a lot of different agencies, but that building is, I mean, the vessel is really, it's not really a sculpture, it's an architectural structure.
Yeah.
So it could probably not necessarily have to go through traditional art approval process, because although it is a work of art, it is kind of a building that, and it has like kind of building requirements. So I think it's inspiring.
Indeed it is. Yes. We'll have a mic coming for you.
Yes, I was wondering if you could comment briefly about taking down sculptures. That seems to be something that we're experiencing a lot now today.
Well, certainly. There have been a lot of monuments taken down that meant one thing in one period of time and no longer mean the same thing, which has been very much in the press of late. And certainly artists are some of the first people to jump right in and do things with some of the sculptures that have been taken down, replacing them with other sculptures. Who wants to, Alex, do you want to jump in?
I'll talk about that. So maybe a good example to talk about here is the case of Sam Duran's scaffold, which appeared last year, or was it 2 years ago?
2 years
2 years ago,
at the
yeah.
Walker?
At the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. And that work was originally staged for an edition of Documenta, which is a quinquennial that takes place in Germany. The work was, basically, it looked like a scaffold. And you wouldn't know this unless you read up on it, but it was meant to mimic almost like to the T the same sort of structure that was used for the hanging of I think more than 30 members of the Dakota Nation, I believe, in the 1860s or so. That work obviously really hit a nerve with the local community who protested the work extensively, particularly members of the Dakota tribe. And what the museum decided to do, which ended up being controversial in its own right, is they got into a dialogue with the Dakota tribe and said to them, like, what should we do about this? And they said, well, you should take it down, but we should ceremonially, well, first they said we're going to ceremonially burn it, then they decided to ceremonially bury it.
Yeah. Wow.
And when they buried it, the reason for this was so that something new could grow out of it, basically. So it was a very interesting way of solving the issue of how do we deal with a work that's controversial and also one that's like, well, how do we dismantle it? Because you want to keep it in some capacity.
And the artist supported that.
Yeah, the artist supported it as well. It was a very elegant way of solving the issue, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Here, a question in the front row. Mike's on the way.
Hi, thank you. I'm from Pittsburgh, and I'm a commissioner for the city art commission. I'm in the case of Sam Durant as well. I mean, you talked about context, and in Germany, that's you talk about history and whose history, and then you have that same kind of structure in a different location, and then that, brings into question, like, for whom this is for. And so with Hudson Yard, you look at that structure, and that is public and private money that's is involved. My question is, like, some of the works that are around the city here, some are temporary, and some are permanent. And sometimes when you say something is temporary, it could be 10 years, it could be 20 years. So, and Hank, you said you're on the city's Public Art Commission. So how do you deal with those kinds of time frames?
There's some stuff that has been up for so long that there's nobody to give it to.
Yeah.
So the city winds up being like, I guess we're going to take it. Right. But I know the big push in the city is to try to make the public monument, at least, to be more representational of the richer history of the city. And there's like a really crazy number of so few, maybe there's 7 or 10 that represent women, and 3 of them are fictional. Like there's Alice in Wonderland sculpture, and so there are some of African American men, but and a few Asian American men. But by and large, the over 80% of the public sculptures represent kind of long dead white men.
Right. Yep.
And there's not necessarily, from my personal perspective, a need to necessarily take them all down. But I do think we should all be willing to reconsider public space, meaning there's a Christopher Columbus sculpture that's been up for 100 years or so. Does it need to be up for another 100 years, or could something else
Or you could just go like Tetsumishi and build something around it.
Yeah, I'm more just saying there's
so
only
much
limited
space.
space that we can have, that you need to we need to. I mean, there's sentimentality, but we should be willing to have really lively debates about do we still need this one?
Yep.
I feel like there should always be, depending on whether it's one sculpture or a series of sculptures, I think that we should think about as a city. I feel like when a sculpture or an installation of any kind sort of occupies this city, I think that when it's time for it to come down, as I know my sculptures are up until the end of July, which is pretty long time for the park.
Ours are usually 3 to 6 months on Park Avenue.
It would be great if one would be somehow donated to the city to sort of live, maybe, like you said, for the next 100 years somewhere, so that it becomes, it creates a sort of dialogue with the city and the history of public art for the city, so that it doesn't just get dismantled. I always use Los Angeles as an example from an architectural standpoint. Amazing architecture just gets torn down. Why not sort of be able to breathe more life into it and somehow maintain its sort of integrity and its history in that city, in the same way that these sculptures that you and I and other artists have created will continue to outlive who we are as another representation of that record, of that memory.
there's a default kind of validity that one gives themselves when they get to ride a horse. And, you know, and I think that's the real valuable question. It's like, now that we recognize, now that the wool has been removed from our eyes, and we recognize that most of these statues were designed for us to follow and obey a certain system that didn't benefit most of us.
Yep.
But has benefited us in some ways. I just think there could be a quota of guys on horses.
Yeah, that would be a good thing to do, most certainly. Okay, well, thank you all so very much for being part of the panel, to the panelists, and for the audience for spending an hour of your Saturday with us here today. I hope you're able to go through the fair and see some of the best art the world has to offer. And Linda, thank you and your team once again for organizing today.
Thank you.
I'd like to point out before we give this wonderful panel an outstanding round of applause, is that Simone Lee image is in the brochure on page 4, and it tells me also that the booth number is 364. If you want to see not this one, but a similar one in that booth, it's well worth your time.
Indeed.
I'd also say that we did a panel in the fall of 2018 on public monuments. That was quite interesting, including discussion of Teddy Roosevelt on a horse, of course, as we know, who was quite contested in front of the Museum of Natural History. So it might be worth, if you're interested, a glance at that for a few moments. This has been wonderful. As usual, it feels like just the beginning of the conversation. So we have to think about what we do in part 2. That'll be our next planning. Thank you so much for being here, and a round of applause for this fantastic panel. Thank you.